Welcome to another episode of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding the interdisciplinary world of Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University. In the last episode, we examined the second volume of Marx's Capital. There, Marx demonstrates how surplus value that has already been produced in Volume 1 now circulates through the veins of the capitalist system and ends up becoming the revenue streams or income streams of people occupying, competing, and contending positions in this circuit of capital. This week, we connect the discussion last week to the question of ideology. Specifically, we explore how finance capitalists, industrial capitalists, and merchants defend the virtues of their unique class positions by positing the risk theory, the innovation and entrepreneurial genius theory, and the markup theories of profits to defend bourgeois theories of value and class. To make sense of all of this, as always, we have Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, a man who knows everything about Marxian as well as non-Marxian economics, Professor Richard Wolff. How are you, Professor?
Very good. I know a lot about toilet plumbing also.
Maybe we will get a chance to discuss that as well. But Rick, I really have a simple question that I wanted to begin with. Since you've studied at basically the top economics departments by ranking in the world, Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, and between you and Steve, we cover MIT as well. And I'm assuming that many of the Nobel laureates today were at some point or another either your class fellows or friends, etc. So my question is, why don't you all agree on the right theory of value and profit?
Yes, that's because when you study toilet plumbing, it gives you a different vantage, a different perspective. You're looking from the ground up, you might say. And perhaps I can beat this metaphor for another half an hour. No, the reason that we are different is that we approach the issue of economics, the subject matter, the way of articulating an explanation for what goes on from radically different intellectual commitments. That became clear to me in my education, undergraduate and graduate. I was there in order to understand capitalism, in order to be better able to go beyond it. My fellow students, with a few exceptions, but most of my fellow students had no such objective, no such goal. They were looking for a secure job. They were looking for an interesting place to work. They were looking for career recognition from the people in the field. They were not of no interest to me. I don't come from wealth, so I had to worry about earning a living. But those things were secondary to me. I had the idea that one could understand capitalism from the perspective of someone who wants to go further. And when I eventually encountered the work of Karl Marx, you can imagine that I was excited, above all because that seemed to be his goal, that what he was doing was responding to a capitalism that had not only evolved, but had been very carefully celebrated by Adam Smith, by David Ricardo, and countless others. And remember, Marx spent a great deal of time and effort reading through all the economists before him. The three-volume work, Theories of Surplus Value, is basically a collection of the notebooks that Marx kept on all of the other writers. And if you ever go through that, you'll see very quickly the emergence of an intellect who's looking through the literature to see what is useful for a critical perspective, such as he then articulates in his pamphlets and in Das Kapital, both the notebooks and the finished version of it, or at least volume one that he completed. So I became very interested in Marx because I sensed a shared objective, and my teachers had no such objective. In their view, capitalism was wonderful. There was no need to go beyond it. You probably couldn't go beyond it, even if you thought there was a need. And the closest they got was to recognize that there are some problems. There are poor people, and that's a problem. And there is unequal wealth and distribution, which is okay, but not beyond extremes. And we find those extremes sometimes. So that's a concern. And yeah, the tendency to have business cycles is worrying. That sort of cyclical up and down, having resisted so far every effort to stop it, is a cause for some worry. Thank God for John Keynes, that he could come along and help us understand and, more importantly, control those cycles so they don't spin out and threaten the system. But the reason they came up with a different theory is because when they looked at the literature, they were excited about the growing, in their view, consensus around first, before the 1870s, around classical political economy, Smith, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and all of them. And then after the 1870s, the adjusted consensus around neoclassical economics. And so that was what they immersed themselves in. And that's why for them, value is about utility, not about labor and not about work time. And this is one of those separation points, not the only one, but one of those separation points, which when you add them up and when you elaborate over a century or more since 1870, is producing altogether different paradigms of analysis.
Thank you. One of the illusions that was taught to people like me and numerous other economics students is this idea that economics is a science. And I bought that idea like many other budding economists. But I was reading Althusser's Reading Capital the other day, and there he gives the example. He compares economics or political economy with chemistry, and he says that in the chemistry department, for example, no one had any problem whatsoever rejecting the phlogiston theory in favor of oxygen. So my question is, what is it about economics specifically? For example, some of your friends back at Harvard would have studied in the chemistry department. I'm assuming that none of them believe in the phlogiston theory today. So what is it specifically about economics in particular that it makes it ideological, if you like? What is it about this discipline? Because you've spent your entire life thinking about this.
Well, let me respond by reminding you of Marx's wonderful enjoyment of playing with the notion of uneven development. In my way of thinking, scientific revolutions, by which I mean what that term came to mean in the works of Imre Lakatos and countless others, both in the United States and overseas, Gaston Bachelard in France, Georges Canguilhem, and many others. And that is the notion that periodically sciences accumulate so many different anomalies, things that don't fit in the framework of the science, that if the conditions are right, these anomalies will lead to what they used to call a scientific, or if you like, an epistemological break. That is, suddenly what was simply an anomaly handled as maybe a problem of your data, maybe you didn't collect the data correctly, or you didn't process it correctly, or you didn't make enough observation, whatever the excuse is for the anomaly, a point is reached. And by the way, Bachelard and Canguilhem, and based on their work, even Michel Foucault, were brilliant in giving us examples of how and when that happens in a science. But it depends on the particular history of that science. It depends on the context, or if you like Althusser, the overdeterminations of that kind of accumulation of anomalies as to whether and when and where and how a break, epistemological break. Look, if you look at economics, then there was something like that in the 1870s. The way I understand it, you had the classical political economy, then you had, which celebrated capitalism and which basically loved it. And then you have Marx coming well after Smith and Ricardo in time, who is a critic and who points out all kinds of contradictions and lapses and absences and anomalies, but he's not taken seriously theoretically. The people who are dominant in the 19th century mostly ignored Marx, and he would probably never have been known enough for you and I to encounter him were it not for the fact, the peculiar fact, that a political movement, namely a workers' movement in Germany more than anywhere else, found in Marx's work a kind of intellectual rationale for much of what they were thinking. And there weren't that many who did, but there were enough of them, and they were strategically placed inside the Socialist Party of Germany, that Marx became known because he was associated with the very rapid rise of the Socialist Party in Germany across the middle of the 19th century. No other capitalist country had anything like that. And in Germany, it exploded. By the end of the 19th century, already by the 1870s, if you were a German intellectual, the rise of socialism was all around you. The leader of your country, a representative of the nobility and the highest levels of the bourgeoisie, Otto von Bismarck, recognized the socialists and made the argument to the German leaders that they have to meet the socialists halfway, otherwise they risk being overthrown by these people, which was a shock to the leaders of Germany who hadn't imagined such a thing, but they had to take it seriously. And when Bismarck then created the basis of what is the modern welfare state, that begins in Germany as a reaction of the nobility and the highest levels of the bourgeoisie against the rise of socialism, and therefore they encountered Marx. And they made the accommodation of a epistemological break, because the classical political economy was grounded on the labor theory of value. Again, a reminder, Smith had a labor theory of value, Ricardo had a labor theory of value, and so did Marx. But Marx took it in a different direction. to be very crude, Marx said, that's right, value is the product of labor, so labor should decide what to do with its own product, thereby rendering the landlord and the capitalist redundant, unnecessary, exploiters. Well, clearly, for the people who ran Germany, the nobility on the one hand and the highest levels of the bourgeois, emerging bourgeois economy, this was utterly unacceptable. And the solution to that contrast, that conflict, was an epistemological break made by Carl Jevons in England, by Menger in German-speaking Europe, and by Valrat in French-speaking Switzerland and France. And they all did it at the same time, which should give you a clue that something in these otherwise very different cultures and societies was coming together in the same way and produced a new theory which was able to say, which is what it said, we don't have to worry about what Marx had to say, because it was premised on the labor theory of value. And we have just made an epistemological break, rejecting the labor theory of value, reconstructing modern economics on the foundation of a utility theory of value. That allows us to proceed with our tasks, and we don't have to worry about Marxism because it has no grounding that is sustainable. We have done with the labor theory of value. That's why the greatest, or arguably one of the greatest of the German neoclassicals, Eugen von Boehm-Bawerk, is famous for writing a book, the Abschluss des Marxistischen System, translated into English as The Close of Marx's System, in which he shows that you can't reduce prices to values the way Marx had said. And this then becomes a wonderful demonstration of how the labor theory of value is dysfunctional, therefore to be dropped. And I can't tell you how many times my colleagues in the American economic establishment, including leftists, have told me what a burden it is that Marxism continues to link itself to the labor theory of value, that we should cut that link. We should do interesting things with Marxian theory, but not tie it to this discredited, silly, inappropriate. It shows you how powerful these things are. But my last point to your question, we can't know. No one ever knows in advance when the epistemological break, or the scientific break, if you like, happens. How many anomalies? How serious do they have to be? How cumulative might their impact be? And what are the external overdeterminants? You have to know all that to know when it's going to happen. And you can't know all that. And so there's always an element of mystery. You know you're in the process, but you can't know for sure exactly how it will happen and when. And that shouldn't be too upsetting to people, because that's the story of your death. You know one thing, you're going to die, but exactly how and when and from what, and you don't know.
Rick, one of the things that, and the reason why we've devoted this and the next episode to this particular question, is that many people, including economists, fail to understand that capitalism is an economic system, that we live in an economic system. And Marx keeps reminding us, I want audiences to refer back to what we did in season 1, where Professor Wolff explained that Karl Marx is basically a philosopher doing economics, who's understood that, using Hegel, there's some link here between subjectivity and how people form ideas about things. And Marx really criticizes bourgeois economics for presenting capitalism as a natural, as a trans-historical kind of economic system. So here's my question, because you've taught the history of economic thought for many decades. Um, when Marx looks at these moments in the development of economic thought, physiocracy, mercantilism, and later Smith and Ricardo and Malthus and all the rest of it, how does he bring his Hegelian understanding of the formation of ideas and how they transform to his reading of the history of economic thought? Because I remember that you and Steve used to use the theories of surplus value to explain the subjective ideas that people had about the economy. Can you help us understand these moments, physiocracy, mercantilism, and how they tie into the ideological biases of people occupying various class positions?
Sure. Um, if I've understood your question correctly, there is a section in volume 2, actually, toward the beginning, where Marx talks about what he calls the metamorphoses of capital, or the circuits of capital. There are different translations and different notions. But to use your words at the beginning of today's conversation, seeing how the output, and particularly the surplus portion of the output, works its way through the system. The appropriating capitalist distributes it to this one, who then uses it for that purpose, and it moves around. And you can begin to understand what it means when you say, in a general populistic kind of way, that the idea here is, and I believe it is Marx's idea, that everything in capitalism depends on everything else, and that therefore everything depends on the surplus, just like everything depends on cuisine, and everything depends on the fashion in clothing, and everything depends on music, and so forth. But that means it's legitimate to look at the society through the lens of the production and distribution of surplus, because that is as good a way into the overdetermination of everything by everything as anything else is. But if you're a critic who uses that idea of the surplus, as Marx did, if you explain, as we talked about it in volume 1, that the surplus is the fruit of an exploitation, as Marx teaches it, well, then you can see why this would be an attractive way to get in to the relationships of an economy, watching the surplus from its production as it then moves through the society and touches everything else, music, politics, culture, whatever you want. But for the same reason, a person who's not taken by the idea of exploitation, who doesn't like that idea, who wants to believe in a liberal image that the society is made up of many individuals and that we are all created in the image of our Creator. And that, in other words, we are all human beings with needs and desires and so forth. And all that the economy is we individuals encounter one another and discover that we can engage in relationships to our mutual benefit. That's why there's no coercion, there's no power you have to worry about. We enter into relationships because you and I, who have the relationship, both benefit by producing and sustaining the relationship. This is an image that is much more attractive, much more supportive for a person who's happy with the status quo, whose most exciting moments are going to the mall to see what wonderful new things are available in the stores for you to wear or eat or sleep in or whatever else. So they will love an economic theory which begins by individuals with their desires, encountering one another and discovering how they can mutually benefit by entering into relationships. It makes the relationships mutually desired and therefore not conflictual. They don't want conflict. They find conflict upsetting. In other words, who you are and where you are in the system shapes how you are likely to look at that system, to study that system, to inspect that system. And thereby you get back to Hegel's dialectic, that the world shapes how you think about the world, and the how you think about the world shapes the world. And the dialectic is the endless mutual transformation. But when it comes to economics, one of the results of this is that I look at economics through the lens of exploitation and surplus, and my colleagues look at it through the lens of utility maximization by individuals exchanging commodities. And that summarizes, it's oversimplified, but it summarizes how you end up going in these different directions. And in the United States, especially in the last 75 years, you did not only have this kind of intellectual difference, but you had it reinforced by politics. After World War II, the United States entered into a period from which it is now only slowly emerging, a period of sustained hysteria. A picture of a country caught up in a sustained hysteria. Very important to understand that. What was the hysteria? It was actually capitalism. Capitalism in the 1930s had collapsed. And in the collapse of capitalism in the West, particularly, the American working class, like certain other, but not all other working classes, but the American working class lurched to the left politically. When I talk, particularly to audiences around the world, this part of American history is intrinsic to what the story of economics is, and therefore give me a moment to spell it out. In the 1930s, the capitalist system collapsed. Millions of people were thrown out of work. It began in October of 1929. It wasn't finished until 1941. This was the worst collapse of capitalism in that system's history. And the American working class lurched to the left. Millions of people joined a new labor movement. The CIO, it was called, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. These were people who had never been in a union before, whose parents had not only not been in unions, had never heard of them. Suddenly, their children joined out of a desperate desire to get through a collapsed decade of dead capitalism in better shape than if they tried to do it all as an individual. So they joined unions. They also joined two separate socialist parties, the Socialist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, both of whom became very large organizations with many tens of thousands of active militant members, and a Communist Party, which was also very large, and they worked together, communists, both socialists, and the CIO. And they produced a powerful, organized left. And that left went to the president a middle of the road centrist Democrat, like the people running the Democratic Party today, the Obamas, the Clintons, the Bidens, all of that. And they went to him and they basically said to him something you'll have to understand. We are now 30, 40 million American workers. We're organized by socialists and communists, and we're all in the union. And we can make you a successful president. But if you don't do what we are telling you to do, you won't be the president. We'll vote you right out of office. And Mr. Roosevelt, being a smart politician, understood, no bluff, this was real. So the deal was made. The president would give them modern social democracy overnight if they stopped talking about revolution. So they had to shut down the most militant of the socialists and communists, which they did, and they accepted the deal. And in very short order, the Social Security system of the United States was created. The unemployment compensation system of the United States was created. The first minimum wage ever in this country was created. And a public jobs program that hired 15 million unemployed people was created. There's never been remotely like that any kind of left-wing surge. And here comes the best part. How did a government, in the midst of the worst collapse of its economy, when the government had no money, millions of people unemployed, paid no taxes, tens of thousands of bankrupt businesses paid no taxes, the government had no money. So Mr. Roosevelt had to go to the rich and say, the only way to survive is to create this social democracy, and you are the ones who are going to pay for it. I'm going to raise your taxes, and I'm going to require that you lend the government lots of money. And that's what they did. The rich and the corporations taxed and borrowed from to produce a vast program of benefit to the working class. It, again, I can't exaggerate this, it terrified the capitalist class of this country. It was the closest to challenging their domination since the country became independent. They saw the end of what America meant to them. So that at the end of the war, 1945, the war that was the culmination of taking care of everybody, because the remaining unemployed were put in a uniform or put into work in a factory to make the uniform. So that was the final Keynesian spending program, if you like. And so in 1945, the ruling class of this country understood it had one priority. It had to roll back what had happened. The name of what was done in the 30s was called the New Deal. And so the program of the ruling class of this country, starting in 1945, was to undo the New Deal. That's been the agenda from 1945 to right now as I'm talking to you. Mr. Trump is simply the latest incarnation of that program. And in order to do that, you had to come up with a rationale for destroying the New Deal coalition, the CIO, two socialist parties, and the Communist Party. And the way to do that was to fasten on the Communist Party as the weakest link of that coalition, and to do it together with a program that demonized the Communist Party so that their identity would not be the most militant among the left-wing surge of the 1930s, but would instead become evil agents of a foreign power, the Soviet Union. Overnight, The Soviet Union, which had been the ally of the United States during the war, became the ultimate Stalinist horror. But that was secondary. The American working ruling class didn't care about the Soviet Union. Wasn't very important. Soviet Union was a very poor country. It was economically neither a threat nor barely on the radar. And the ideological power slim. No. You had to create a fantastic psychodrama, the French call it, psychodrama of the horrible, they're coming for you. If you want to understand anti-communism after World War II, then pay attention to the anti-immigrant rhetoric of the last 2 or 3 years. The invasion of these criminals. Look at Mr. Trump. All Mexicans are rapists. The language is the language of hysterics. In that environment, Marx was associated with the Communist Party and with the Soviet Union. It therefore became obligatory for every young intellectual in the American academic universe, in economics, but in other fields as well, to show, in case anyone was paying attention, I'm no Marxist. I got nothing to do with Marxists. Watch me dismiss Marxism in a half a minute with, my first introduction at Harvard was a professor who explained how silly Marxism is, because obviously it takes more than a worker to make things. They have to have tools, don't you know? To say to such a person that what you've just said indicates that you are not the sharpest knife in the drawer is a polite way of saying, you must be kidding. But they weren't. And my colleagues that you're asking about, they are the products of a 70-year hysteria in which people took pride in not understanding or reading or learning from the most important critical perspective that capitalism has so far engendered. People will look back on this period of American history and shake their heads in disbelief.
Thank you very much, Rick. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, guys. Marx famously said that the ruling ideas are in every epoch the ideas of the ruling class. Today, we learned from Professor Wolff that who you are, where you are in the system, shapes how you think about the economy. In the next episode, we're going to return to this problem because many of you have been interested in the risk theory and the markup theories of profit. We're going to ask Professor Wolff what he makes of these two versions of the theories of value. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of it. I'll see you all in the next episode. Take care, guys. Thank you.